Hello friends, welcome to our lecture series on CSR. This is basically a live lecture series on corporate social responsibility, and in the series of our lectures on CSR, this is going to be part 4 of lectures on our lecture series on CSR. And in today's lecture of mine, I'll be continuing my discussion on legal framework of CSR in India. We'll first talk about the Schedule 7 of Companies Act 2013. What are those listed list of CSR activities which are being mentioned under Schedule 7 of Companies Act 2013. We'll also have a discussion on broad framework of CSR, and eventually we'll talk about frequently asked questions on applicability of CSR provisions. So keeping in mind the requirement of section 135, whenever we talk about section 135, we feel that this is the only section where the provisions related to CSR expenditure is mentioned. And at the very outset, when I was telling you about the legal framework of CSR, I told you that when we talk about CSR provision, section 135 is supposed to be read with the CSR rules 2014, and along with that we need to have a understanding of Schedule 7 of Companies Act 2013, which is basically a prescriptive list of CSR activities. And for your information, I am just sharing here that under Schedule 7, the total number of activities which are listed is 12, and it is very much available on the website of Ministry of Corporate Affairs. You can find it there also, and I'll be telling you those prescriptive list of those prescriptive activities on which, if you are spending as a company, it will be considered to be a part of your expenditure on CSR. And of course, when we say expenditure on CSR, 2% of your net profit which is supposed to be spent on CSR. Exclusions I have already discussed in the previous lecture of mine, that what are those activities which are not included in the prescriptive list of CSR activities, and those exclusions we have discussed. They were 6 in number. So 6 activities which we have already discussed, they are not included under the prescriptive list of CSR activities, and the list which is prescribed in Schedule 7, that I am going to discuss here as of now. So the first very activity is eradicating hunger, poverty and malnutrition, promoting healthcare, including preventive healthcare and sanitation, including contribution to the Swachh Bharat Kosh set up by the central government for the promotion of sanitation, and making available the safe drinking water. So the first very activity is if you look at the basket of the first activity, it is also very wide, that within the first activity we are talking about the health. Broadly, it focuses on health, and if you are doing something, if your company is spending some amount which is contributing amount on any activity which is contributing towards eradication of hunger or poverty or malnutrition. Suppose if you are working for the development of for the betterment of those children which are suffering from this problem of malnutrition, promoting healthcare, including preventive healthcare. Or for sanitation, suppose if you are contributing to Swachh Bharat Kosh, that will also be accounted for under this activity, which is from the prescriptive list of CSR activities. And to be very specific, to be very precise in legal terms, we will call it Schedule 7, point number 1. So if you are doing something for making available safe drinking water to the citizens of our country, then of course that will also be accounted for under the prescriptive list of CSR activities. So if I as a company, as a corporate entity, I am spending any amount on any of these activities, then of course that is going to be allowed under the prescriptive list of CSR activities. It will be accounted for under as CSR activity. Second one is for education after health. Second one is education. The broad category is education. If you are promoting education in any manner, and when we say promotion of education, it has many different many aspects to be dealt with, and it includes special education also, and employment enhancing vocational skills, especially among children, women or elderly. And along with that, if your company is doing something for the differently abled and livelihood enhancement projects, that will also be accounted for as CSR activities. So that will actually be considered as that expenditure will actually be allowed as per the provisions of Schedule 7 of Companies Act 2013. So if you are promoting any expenditure incurred by my company is promoting education in any manner, It may include special education also if we are working for the employment enhancing vocational skills. Suppose my company is contributing towards the startup activities, startup programs of any organization, any university, and specifically for women, children or elderly people, that will also be allowed as CSR expenditure. So after health and education, we have got the third one. If any expenditure incurred by my company promotes gender equality, it empowers women, setting up homes and hostels for women and orphans, setting up old age homes, daycare centers and such other facilities for senior citizens, and measures for reducing inequalities faced by socially and economically backward group. If we are spending on these activities, that will also be accounted for as CSR activity. So after health education, we are also looking at gender equality, empowering women as another dimension of expenditure on CSR. Next one is ensuring environmental sustainability. If my company is spending some amount which contributes towards the sustainable environment, ecological balance, protection of flora and fauna of our country, animal welfare, it can be agroforestry, it can be conservation of natural resources, and along with that, suppose if we are maintaining the quality of soil, air and water, which basically contributes to the different when we talk about soil, air and water, we also look at the kind of pollution we are witnessing in our environment. So it includes contribution to the Clean Ganga Fund set up by the central government for rejuvenation of river Ganga. Government of India is having a very ambitious project of rejuvenation of river Ganga, which is also connected with the sentiments of with the religious sentiments of our citizens. And along with that, since the rivers are regarded as our lifeline, and then of course government is very much serious about those activities. So if your company contributes towards the Clean Ganga Fund set up by the government, that will also be regarded as an allowed expenses under the category of CSR expenditure. So basically what I'm trying to explain here is that under Schedule 7 there are 12 broad activities which explains that if you are spending money on any of these activities from the total fund of 2% of your profit on CSR, it will be regarded as an allowed expenses. It will be included under the head of that CSR activity, because when you'll be filing your return, when you will be submitting your return to ROC, then of course they'll have to look at it that whether the compliance is proper or not. So Schedule 7 is basically acting as a benchmark, as a standard for that, and that is supposed to be checked by the authorities. So we have to be very cautious while spending on CSR activities, that it should not be like that I have spent this money and later on it is not allowed. So it's better to have a complete knowledge of the legal provisions, because ignorance of law has no excuse, that we are supposed to know. So if you are maintaining the quality of soil, air and water, including contribution to the Clean Ganga Fund, that is also an allowed expenses. Next one is suppose if you are spending on protection of national heritage, art and culture, including restoration of buildings and sites of historical importance and works of art. Suppose if you are working towards the restoration of certain historical sites, then that is also allowed under Schedule 7. That is also one of the listed activities under Schedule 7. You are setting a public library or promotion and development of traditional art and handicrafts. So if you are promoting or developing the traditional arts and handicraft, that is also one of the listed activities under Schedule 7. Next one is measures for the benefit of armed forces veterans, war widows and their dependent. And basically when we talk about armed forces, we believe that we are talking about Central Armed Police Forces. Of course we are talking about Central Armed Police Forces, which is called as CAPF. But along with that, even it is applicable for paramilitary forces. Like in our country we have, for instance, ITBP, Indo-Tibetan Border Police. It is basically acting as a paramilitary force. So Central Paramilitary Forces, veterans and their dependents, including widows, they for their betterment, if you are spending some money as a corporate entity, that is also one of the allowed activities, one of the listed activities under Schedule 7. Next one is, suppose if you are training to promote rural sports, in a rural area, suppose if you are promoting the sports, nationally recognized sports or Paralympic sports or Olympic sports, that is also one of the allowed activities under CSR because it is a listed activity. Contribution to the Prime Minister's National Relief Fund or Prime Minister's Citizen Assistance and Relief in Emergency Situations Fund, that is PM CARES Fund, that is also an allowed expenses. So in place of spending, suppose if your company is not able to spend on the identified activities and somehow you thought it appropriate to contribute to the PM CARES Fund or Prime Minister's National Relief Fund, that is PMNRF, that is also an allowed expenses under Schedule 7 because it is listed there as one of the prescriptive activity under the provisions of Companies Act 2013. Any other fund set up by the central government for socio-economic development and relief and welfare of the scheduled caste or the scheduled tribes, other backward classes, minorities and women, for them also if you are contributing to those funds, that is also an allowed expenses. It is allowed under Schedule 7 because it is one of the listed activity. Next is contribution to incubators or research and development projects in the field of science, technology, engineering and medicine funded by central government or state government, or it can be funded by any public sector undertaking, that is PSU or any other agency of the central government or state government, if they are funding those incubators. Like nowadays we talk about the incubators at different educational institutions, startup incubators to promote those startups, and if your company is contributing, it is funded by either a state government or central government or any PSU or any other agency of central government or state government, and we are contributing to those incubators or research and development projects in the field of science, technology, engineering and medicine, then of course that is also one of the prescribed activities of CSR. Next is contribution to public funded universities. When we talk about public funded universities, it includes universities, it is basically the educational institutions we are talking about, IITs, national laboratories and autonomous bodies established under DST, Department of Science and Technology, Department of Pharmaceuticals, Ayush, DRDO, ICMR, CSIR. So all these institutions, if you are contributing, the list is the prescriptive list is given there, and it has a mention of all those bodies which are established, autonomous bodies established under DAE, DBT, DST, Department of Pharmaceuticals, Ayush, DRDO, ICAR, ICMR, CSIR, and if you are contributing to those projects, then of course that is one of the allowed expenses, that is one of the prescribed activity of CSR. Suppose if you are, as a company, you are contributing to rural development projects, that is also allowed. Slum area development, suppose for slums you are spending some money for their betterment, then of course that is also allowed. Disaster management including relief, rehabilitation and reconstruction, if your company is spending on any of these three aspects of disaster management, whether it is relief or it is rehabilitation or it is reconstruction, all three are allowed because they are in the prescriptive list of activities of CSR. So my dear learners, this was all about Schedule 7, the provisions of Schedule 7. So they included 12 points. So those 12 points I have discussed with you here, and out of those 12 listed activities, if you are spending on any one of them, or say 3-4 of them, or all of them, that is going to be considered as CSR activity, as an expenditure on listed CSR activities by your company. But do remember that whenever you are planning for your company, you are planning for CSR expenditure, just try to have a complete check over the excluded activities. So whatever you are spending, it should not fall under the category of those exclusions. So stay alert from exclusions and try to have a look on these 12 important listed activities which is basically published by the Ministry of Corporate Affairs under Schedule 7. So basically, if you look at all these 12 activities, you will find that the government has identified, the ministry has identified those areas which requires contribution of corporate entities, because government alone cannot do the entire work. it requires certain assistance from certain level of assistance from corporate entities. So these corporate entities, they are basically working a lot significantly. They are contributing to the betterment of our society. And in due course of our discussion on CSR, I will be showing you the total amount of total budget of CSR which is being spent by the corporate entities for making our country a better country to live. Then of course their contribution cannot be undermined. And that actually provides us the roaring data on CSR expenditure. And the beauty of this provision of section 135, that companies are merely contributing 2% of their profit, and the results are basically wonderful. You are finding wonderful results on these aspects, on these activities which government has identified, which government has listed under Schedule 7. Now let us have a look at recent amendments in Schedule 7. The first one was notified on 23rd of May 2020, and it included PM CARES. Earlier PM CARES was not there because this is a fund which was established during COVID-19, during the pandemic of COVID-19. So this PM CARES fund has been inserted in basically the list of in the listed activities of Schedule 7. And it shall be effective from the retrospective date, that is 28th of March 2020, and it was basically to deal with this global pandemic of COVID-19. So this was the recent amendment in Schedule 7, which basically incorporated PM CARES fund. If your company is contributing to PM CARES fund, that will actually be an allowed expenditure on CSR. Another notification came on 26th of May 2020, and basically it talked about the benefit to Central Armed Forces, CAPF, which I told you, and Central Paramilitary Forces, and for them it was included. After that, another notification came on 24th of August 2020, and it was basically related to bifurcation of activities mentioned under clause 9 of schedule. So basically clause 9 talked about the contribution to incubators or research and development in various fields of science, technology, medicine, etc. So this was basically an inclusion, this was basically a bifurcation of activity which was included in clause 9. So total 12 clauses are there under Schedule 7, which we have discussed in today's lecture, and I hope you have understood what are those activities on which we are supposed to spend, which we are supposed to keep in our mind while planning our expenditure on CSR. Schedule 7 list is available on the website of Ministry of Corporate Affairs, and you can refer to that because it provides all the dates also, that on which date which activity got some amendments, and I have also explained to you what are those amendments. Now coming to the broad framework of CSR and frequently asked questions. The broad framework of CSR has been provided in section 135 of Companies Act 2013, Schedule 7 of the Act, and Companies CSR Rules 2014. So whenever we talk about CSR, the legal framework of CSR in India, we have to remember it has three parts. One is section 135 of Companies Act 2013. Another is CSR Policy Rules 2014, and third one is Schedule 7 of the Act. So if you wish to have a complete information, complete idea about the CSR enactment in India, we have to go through all these three important components of the legal framework of CSR in India. And further, the ministry had also issued clarifications including frequently asked questions from time to time on various issues concerning CSR. And why they have done so? Because a number of significant developments have taken place since the insertion of this, since the emergence of this section 135, the provision of section 135 under Companies Act 2013. The ministry has notified the amendments in section 135 of the Act as well as in the CSR rules, and on 22nd January 2021, the Government of India came up with basically a list of FAQs, and this amendment was with an aim to strengthen the CSR ecosystem by improving disclosures and by simplifying compliances. So to ensure that there is no confusion and there is a complete clarity on different aspects of legal provisions related to CSR. In response to such amendments, Ministry has received several references and representations from different stakeholders, and they wanted to have clarification from Ministry. So Ministry thought that in place of answering to those questions, why don't we come with some FAQs on applicability of CSR? So I am going to tell you briefly about some important FAQs which are on applicability of CSR, because till now we have discussed about the applicability of CSR provisions on different types of companies operating in India. So the first question is, which companies qualify for CSR under the Companies Act 2013? This is a question, and our lecture started with this very aspect of provision, that any company which is satisfying any of the following criteria during the immediately preceding financial year is required to comply with CSR provisions specified under section 135 subsection 1 of Companies Act 2013, and it has to be read with the company's CSR policy rules 2014. And the provision I told you, either your net worth of rupees 500 crore or more, or turnover of rupees 1000 crore or more, or net profit of rupees 5 crore or more, if you are fulfilling any of these three criteria, your company is supposed to spend 2% of its profit on CSR, listed CSR activity. So every company, remember the provision says that every company which fulfills any of these criteria is supposed to spend 2% of its profit on CSR. Next, second question is, whether a holding or subsidiary of a company fulfilling the criteria under section 135(1) has to comply with the provisions of section 135, even if the holding or subsidiary itself does not fulfill the criteria. So this is a very important question. Answer to this question is no. The compliance with CSR requirement is basically very much specific to every company. So suppose a holding or subsidiary of a company is basically not fulfilling any of three criteria, then of course they are not supposed to comply with the provisions of section 135, because it is not merely because merely they belong to the category of either holding or subsidiary of that company which has to spend on CSR, and my company is not fulfilling those criteria, so I'll be spending on CSR. No, I shall only spend on listed CSR activities. I shall only spend 2% of my average net profit on CSR when my company fulfills the eligibility criteria prescribed under section 135(1). So if my company fulfills any of those three eligibility criteria prescribed under section 135(1), then of course my company will spend on CSR, otherwise no. So a holding or subsidiary of a company is not required to comply with the CSR provisions unless the holding or subsidiary itself fulfills the eligibility criteria. So if I am a holding company or I am a subsidiary company and I am not fulfilling that criteria, then of course I shall not spend on CSR activities. I shall not spend 2% of my profit on CSR activities. Next question is whether provisions of CSR are applicable to section 8 company. I told you yes, it is for every company. It is merely contributing to the working to the cause of social welfare, or working on account of no profit no loss, working as not for profit organization doesn't mean that you are not supposed to comply with the provisions of section 135. The act commences with the word that every company, and thus it is applicable to section 8 companies as well. Section 8 companies are those companies which are basically regarded as not for profit organizations, and they are basically established as a corporate entity, so they are also supposed to spend on listed CSR activities if they are fulfilling that eligibility criteria of section 135 subsection 1. Another question is whether CSR provisions apply to a company which has not completed the period of 3 financial years since its incorporation, which means what about the new company? If my company is new, I fulfill the eligibility criteria, but I don't have a previous 3 years profit, which is supposed to be the basis of calculation of 2% of profit on CSR. Answer is, even then, yes, you are supposed to spend on listed CSR activities. You are supposed to spend 2% of your profit. So if your company has not completed 3 financial years since its incorporation, but if you satisfy that eligibility criteria mentioned in section 135(1), then of course CSR provisions, including spending of at least 2% of the average net profit earned during immediately preceding financial year are applicable. You have to spend 2% of your profit on CSR, even if you are a new company and you don't have previous 3 years of profit. Next question is whether CSR provisions apply to a company, whether the CSR provision applied to a company which is new, then of course for new company also it is applicable. So after having the brief idea about section 1 provisions of section 135, schedule 7, CSR rules, now it's time to know about the compliances. What are the different steps in compliances? First one is that you have to constitute a CSR committee. That every company is supposed to constitute a CSR committee, and that CSR committee is supposed to draft a CSR policy, and you have to spend towards CSR for schedule 7 activities. In due course of our discussion, we'll have a discussion on what is the composition of CSR committee for different types of companies, whether it is same for public company, private company, foreign company, or it is different. The enactment is very much clear. The act is very much clear about the constitution or composition of CSR committee, which we'll be discussing in due course of our lecture series on CSR. We'll also talk about how to draft a CSR policy. While drafting a CSR policies, what are those important points which a company is supposed to keep in mind. And lastly, we'll talk about the spend towards CSR for schedule 7 activities. So under schedule 7 we have already discussed about the total number of 12 clauses, or you can say 12 listed activities, because it's a prescriptive list. If your company is suppose falling under the category of a company which is supposed to spend 2% of its profit on CSR, then those 12 activities are very much significant for us, and we have to plan our strategy in such a way, we have to design a CSR policy in such a way that the expenditure which we are incurring on CSR, it should actually be accounted for as CSR expenditure on CSR. It should not be like that my company has spent some money on certain activity and later on it doesn't qualify to be called as CSR expenditure. So we have to keep this thing in mind while designing our CSR policy. So constitution of CSR committee, drafting a CSR policy is another step which we'll be discussing in due course of our lectures on CSR. In today's lecture of mine, what I thought that I should first tell you that what are those 12 clauses under schedule 7, and they are related to which domain, which area. And my dear learners, you must have understood that basically these are the areas of significance. These are very significant areas on which those 12 clauses are basically targeting. So they are basically related to health, education, malnutrition, upliftment of poor people, armed forces people, paramilitary forces people and their war widows, because they are basically contributing to our nation building. If you are contributing to some educational institutions which are set up by some autonomous bodies or some central government or state government, that is also allowed. PM Cares Fund. So those 12 activities basically provide us the broad areas where my company can plan for our spending on CSR activities. But do remember that those exclusions, 6 exclusions, so 12 inclusions and 6 exclusions, they are basically very much important for us to understand, to design, to draft our CSR policy as a company. So with this, I am ending today's lecture of mine. I hope you must have understood the legal framework of CSR. In the next very lecture of mine, I will tell you about the constitution of CSR committee, how to draft a CSR policy, and of course the penal provisions. What if you are not able to comply with the provisions laid down in section 135 of Companies Act along with schedule 7 and CSR rules 2014? What are the penal provisions? That is also very much important, because initially when this enactment came, there was no penal provision. It was simply either to comply or explain, but now it has some penal provisions also. So with this, I am stopping here only for today's lecture. I hope you must have understood and enjoyed today's lecture of mine. Thank you so much. See you soon.